learning around underperformance. As you probably just noticed, this is going to be recorded for you, and we will send you a link to the recording and to the slides for later. So don't worry about it if you miss something or you want to go back over it. We'll also provide you with any relevant resources that we've got as we go through. So thank you so much for joining me. I'm very grateful to have so many people here. I'm using that term advisedly because I have just finished recording a podcast episode with a guy called Kevin Monroe, which is all about July being the month of gratitude. So it seems really appropriate to practice it. It seems I only came off the podcast recording about 5-10 minutes ago. So my name's Lucinda. I've spent a number of years in corporate learning and development roles. I've also been a line manager, and still am a line manager, and I totally understand how challenging it can be to manage performance issues. I still train on how to drive high performance and also how to deal with underperformance, whether it's culturally or as a line manager. And it's certainly one of the most downloaded topics that we have. So we know that performance is tricky for people. And quite often it's something that people don't always feel comfortable about addressing. And so we thought it was a useful topic to cover. So we have a range of resources on this. And this particular webinar is going to be appropriate to anybody. So let me know in the chat. I've got my introduction up here as to what I do. What is your interest here? Are you coming in as a line manager? Are you someone from HR who wants to understand more about how to manage underperformance in your organization or to train people to manage underperformance? Let us know what you'd like to get out of it, what brings you to this particular topic, so I can do my best to make it as relevant as possible for you. So while you do that, and I'll keep an eye on the chat as what we're coming through here, I'll also just introduce you a little bit to Actus. So my day job, when I'm not doing things like podcasts and webinars, is I'm CEO of Actus, and Actus is the complete performance talent and learning management suite. And the element, I suppose, of it is performance management. Actus was originally all about performance management. And one of the reasons often that underperformance can take place in an organization is where managers don't really have the confidence to manage performance clearly. So they're not clearly setting expectations, they're not maybe having regular one-to-ones, and maybe they're not giving regular feedback. And Actus Perform is something that actually helps managers hang the right behaviors around it and prevent underperformance, as do other tools. It doesn't have to be something done with software, but that's what Actus is very much about. We also have learning management, 360 feedback, and other relevant tools in terms of compliance, etc. So what we're talking about here is, if you feel that you've got a bit of a culture, have we got a culture of underperformance? I want to explore with you. When I've been doing training on this recently, I've been doing training with an international business school on managing underperformance and dealing with it. And one of the senses is that maybe it feels different from pre-COVID, it looks different. So interested to know if that is something you're experiencing. We're going to explore what the causes might be in terms of underperformance, how these can be addressed. Line in the sand, do your line managers understand what a line in the sand is? And just practical ways of turning underperformance round, whatever the cause. So as I say, it's something that's relevant to line managers or to individuals in terms of how you want to come to this. So I'm just going to check the chat and see what hats you've got on here, because very often if you are in an HR role, you are also a manager of people. So let's have a quick look. So just getting some fresh ideas and perspectives. As a challenge, it's a line manager, you find this area challenging. Supporting managers, absolutely. Manager, yeah, great. Hi, Emma. Yeah. Great. Okay, so we've got both, but many of us have got both our HR hat on and our line manager hat on, so that's fine. Some of this you can take, so there's models you can take away from this. There's various resources that will drop into the chat. And also I'll mention at the end, I do have training that we offer on this. You could even do train the trainer on this if it's something that you wanted. So anything that you find useful, hopefully you can take back and it will be of value to you in your roles, whether you're coming in as line manager or as an HR person. So first of all, though, let's carry on using the chat. How would you define underperformance in your understanding, in your organization? What would the definition be? And is that the term you'd use, or is it someone not quite performing? What is the term? Emma's gone, not meeting KPIs and deadlines. Absolutely. Not achieving the target. Not reaching the minimum standard required. See if any others coming up. So those are all pretty clear. Not consistently performing at the standard expected. Not understanding or willfully disregarding expectations, which is slightly different in terms of that. That's a really good point, Sylvia, because I was actually going to ask that question. So all the people have said not achieving a target, KPIs and deadlines, that does assume that you have defined targets, KPIs or deadlines, doesn't it? So making sure, and I'm assuming that you do there. If you don't have them, and anyone on this call where you don't, then that is one of the things. If people don't understand their role, their expectations, then that culturally, and that can happen in it can happen in small, fast-growing businesses and businesses that haven't got processes established so effectively yet, because you can find, or businesses where managers are inconsistent in their style of performance management. That's where you can have a culture of underperformance, because people don't really talk freely and frankly about things. So the starting was, as Sylvia was saying, you have to have clear markers. People need to know what's expected in the first place. And then going to a slightly different level, Charlotte's saying it's not just what's being done, but how it's being done. Both go hand in hand, totally. So if you've got organizational values, then are people behaving in line with those values? Or are their behaviors just generally team working or supporting, or if you don't have values, but there could still be ways in which people are not performing or behaving in a way that's conducive to the kind of working environment you're looking for. So depending on the sizes of business that you're coming from, you may have defined processes. If you do have defined processes, do people follow those defined processes, and do they follow them consistently? Those are things where the culture comes in. And then there's things about the process. It's not just doing the process, it's how the process, how people engage with it, whether they go through the motions or whether they're engaging with it in a way that's genuinely about helping somebody to be clear, to perform, and be supported to perform. So all of those work as underperformance. What I wanted to do, this is what I wanted to just explore with you, and you can choose, I'd say, up to 3 of these options here. I'm interested just to explore whether or not we feel, and use the chat if you do have a view on this, the most common forms of underperformance that you might be coming across in your organization. So you've got a range of choices. You can choose multiple, and I'd say maybe choose 2 or 3 that feel most relevant, because we'll get more interesting information out of this. Yes, Emma, exactly. So underperformance could be someone who is disengaged. That's where I've got apathy in this, or burnt out. And this is, again, it may be easier for you to contribute in the chat here. So talking about this business school that I've been working with, we've been doing some scenarios about what underperformance looks like, and I'm struck by the fact that if I'd have done underperformance or turning around performance training 5-10 years ago, it was more classic, not meeting targets, kind of maybe classic old-fashioned misconduct was the sort of thing you'd be addressing with people. Whereas what I feel now, and in environments where people are working hybrid, maybe it's a knock-on from COVID, is there's a sense that people perhaps just haven't got the energy. So they might have been performing up here, but now they're performing slightly lower. And the interesting question is, if they're still delivering against a day job, are they performing? So if they're still performing against their day job, are they still, is that actually performance, I suppose, the fact their performance has dropped off? So is it really also about us thinking about how do we maintain energy? And I've done on the previous ones, I don't know if any of you listened to the last 2 webinars in this series, we talked very much about how you can engage and encourage people to maintain energy. And that seems to be, I don't know, a scarce resource is my sense with many people. It's quite, because maybe again, because people aren't always working in with people so much. I don't know whether that's your experience or not. Let me know in the chat. Is there something you're seeing there? Is there something about energy, or just not working as hard, the outputs not being as high as they were? Interested to see if you've got the same experience. And actually, this is interesting. So let's see. maybe you are telling me this from this. So underperformance in your organization, 68% of you are saying that low productivity is the issue, is the highest one. And that is really interesting. We don't know what the cause is, do we? But then there's lots in terms of a little bit about not following process, outputs, apathy or low energy, this visibility thing, which is, you know, is that person working really hard but you just can't get hold of them? Persistent absence sickness is often an underlying issue there. That would be a more traditional underperformance element, I think, and maybe lack of teamwork or communication. So without knowing what you think of those, you tell me in the chat what you think of those, because we could theorize away, couldn't we? So low productivity, of course, is compared to what? Is this low compared to expectation, low compared to what they used to be? And again, thinking about, we'll think later about what could be causing that. And this energy or quality, so it's just this sense that people have gone off the boil. Why is that in terms of this, or what can we do about it, really importantly? And then the visibility and the teamwork communication, my concern with that would be people maybe not having that same sense of belonging. Is that disengagement, which I think somebody said further up the chat? Underperforming is disengaged employee. So Mike saying, currently very difficult to determine because people work from home. When in the office, you can clearly see what's happening going on. When working remotely, it's almost impossible to determine if people are working as hard as previous. And I mean, that's an interesting one, isn't it? Because again, this goes back to, are we measuring outputs in the same way as we used to? I mean, if you're getting the benefits of someone working from home, lots of us who presumably quite enjoy working from home might say that actually we work as hard or harder. But is there some difference in output? Don't know. How can we maintain our own energy when underperformance continues for so long? Kat, that's a very valid point, because you know, in actually preventing underperformance, which I think is the moral of the story in all of these things, going back to having routines in terms of managing people, talking about what the expectations are, giving people good quality feedback, helping them to stay energized, tapping into what they want. Those sort of things are preventative, aren't they? If you're dealing with underperformance, you feel like you can't go anywhere. Where do we go from here? And it can really feel exhausting. Even more exhausting if you have to manage someone out of an organization, which obviously you want to avoid. So the purpose of this is talking about how can we turn this round. Lucy, what a good point. So Lucy's saying the biggest cause of underperformance you see is bad managers. So bad being a bit of a value judgment. What do you mean? I'm sure you mean a specific lack of what are they doing? What are the managers doing that isn't good? Lucy, tell us more about that. I think that's a really valid point. That's why lack of teamwork scored highly. Underperformance if working from home is harder to see. Yeah, I think so. And so it might manifest in lack of teamwork, communication, less of that sort of additional energizing, though, that you get from working with people, potentially, which maybe that's what keeps the productivity going, keeps you charged. Hard to say. Keep the chat coming and I'll go through. So my questions, and these are questions, I don't know the answers to this, because every time I run this sort of content, it evolves slightly more in terms of this. So is it purely a visibility thing? Is it that you saw underperformance when someone's office-based? Is it you see underperformance when remote, or is it actual? And I think there's something here in terms of, are we making it up because we're not seeing what people are doing? It's just there. How are we actually mixing this sense of visibility or communication from people with their actual levels of performance or underperformance? And there's something there again culturally, if you think about addressing a culture of this, is we need to encourage people in our organizations, and not just the managers, although I take Lucy's point about telling, if you're telling people, that's very one way, but actually this links into this. So what we need to encourage both managers and individuals is to express, to communicate. So the manager needs to say, okay, what are you doing? How are you going to challenge yourself? What are your expectations this week? What are you working on? So managers need to get the individuals to share their views as to what it is that they're doing, and explain more about what their outputs are, or their deliverables, or their actions are. So using coaching skills to engage or involve the individual on short-term deliverables is going to energize. And I did a 9-box grid about the subtly different behaviors that you want a line manager to do. Some of the time it's literally, it is about coaching. Some of the time it's inspiring, but different behaviors based on the energy levels of that team member and their performance levels, adapting your style. So you definitely want, as line managers, to be more flexible. But there's also this sort of question of, is it the visibility? Is it real? Are they underperforming? Or are they just not expressing what they're doing? Or do we not have the metrics in place, the performance management tools that should clearly define what good performance looks like, so that people can demonstrate they're delivering it regardless of where they're located? Mike says the roles that depend on bouncing ideas off each other, where you're training people being in the room, is crucial. Yes, so it depends on the role in terms of where you get that extra energy, and some remote roles can be very helpful, or isolating if it's 100%. Oh, what's that? Sylvia, radical peer-to-peer work could be an idea for managers, even across organizations. I'd love it if you could put more about that. I'm not familiar with that term, so I'd like to hear more about what radical peer-to-peer work is. So is performance about productivity? It should be, right? It should be really about outputs. If so, are we effectively measuring this, and could that be the problem? So Lucy's saying the biggest cause of underperformance is bad managers, and she's referring to coaching. However, what are you going to coach someone against if we don't have clarity on what the outputs are? So fundamentally, are we clear about what the outputs are that people need to deliver, and do they understand that clarity, and are we effectively measuring it? It is a challenging problem at the moment. So this information I grabbed last year is from 2023. At the time, they were saying that 18% of top executives find holding others accountable as their greatest weakness. So almost 20%. Poor performance consumes up to 17% of a leader's job. Again, really painful. Changing environments and priorities create confusion. I think that's a big one, particularly in certain size businesses that I've been working with, and I'll come back to that one. Also, focusing on outputs rather than inputs. For me, that's where it shouldn't really matter where you work if you are being measured on outputs. Having this sense of presenteeism is about an input. So just because you're physically in an environment, we all know that we can waste lots of time in a desk in an office if we need to, but it's maybe, are we getting enough of that energizing? You really do want to have managers to be on it, but using their coaching skills, because they can't breathe down the neck of the person. They're not actually watching that person day in, day out. So how can we encourage our managers to create a climate of trust, to provide feedback, and to make sure that the individual knows what their outputs are? But there are lots of stressors. So we might have had COVID, a few years ago, but we've now got cost of living stressors, various other things where people are almost more stretched, I think, due to the hybrid environment. For many, this whole concept of sandwich generation I was mentioning to someone, which not everybody understands, but there's quite a lot of people who are managing parents and children and homes, and I don't know how they did it previously, because they must have been doing it previously, but it seems like the pressures are higher on people to be all things to all things to all people. Maybe now, because the delineation between physically being in an office and being at home isn't there so much. I think certainly, I know there's a mixed audience here, particularly for women. You saw during the pandemic that women were doing more of the all work, even though both parties were working from home. I wonder if that has carried on leaching over there. But there's lots and lots of legitimate stressors. But in terms of what can we do, as in if we're here as a manager or if we're here as an HR person, is, are we getting people to focus on outputs? Have they got clear KPIs? Have they got clear objectives and milestones? And if you can influence your leaders, I've done some facilitation recently with particularly small growing businesses. What I found, and this is fairly consistent, is that the CEO, the leader, knows what the priorities are, but they may not have cascaded it or clearly communicated it. The first line has a good idea, but the next line down isn't that sure. And even though they've got some objectives, they see things change. And in lots of smaller businesses that are still establishing processes, there's quite a lot of shifting in priorities, and it's really easy for people to be confused as to what we're trying to achieve here. And again, then that can mean not that people aren't trying to be productive, but more that they are overwhelmed, or they're distracted, or they've got conflicting priorities, and you can really only do one thing at once. So those things can really affect it as well. So let me have a quick look here. Yes, so technology is 2020, 24 hours. Sylvia, can you put more about what radical peer-to-peer work is, unless that's your own just expression? I've heard of radical candor, but I haven't heard of radical peer-to-peer work, so I was just wondering what that was, if it was a thing. So causes of underperformance, this is more moving into just kind of guidance that you could provide your managers with, or you can think about yourself. So if you've got someone who's in front of you and you believe that they are not performing, and you are being clear about that from a factual point of view, there's clear outputs, they've got a clear road profile, you've got clarity, and you've had that conversation with them about what the expectations are, then we need to think about, or you think you've had that conversation, but in your head, it's clear as to what the outputs are for that role, then we should still be open-minded. It's really easy for us to assume that someone's choosing not to perform, but there are usually a whole range of reasons. Now, this simple model, and we've got an infographic and a couple of videos and things that we'll just chuck into the chat, but we'll also send out to you, that you could share with line managers if you wanted to help with this. If I think of an example of underperformance, almost always you can link it into one of these areas. And it's going to be down to either lack of clarity, it could be down to individual attitude or will, as in the person's checked out and doesn't want to be there anymore. It may be down to skill or knowledge, and it may be down to surrounding environment. Now, I feel, or certainly when I first was training on things like this, that clarity was the most common cause of underperformance. I think there's a little bit now about environment that plays into it. That would have been less common, but I think that's more common now, maybe with hybrid working, or people's levels of energy in terms of environment, maybe mixed messages in terms of when and how people work. But if people don't understand clearly what's expected of them, then it's hardly surprising that they're not delivering what you want. And as I alluded to earlier, this whole thing about mixed messages or changing priorities can really affect it. So what we want to encourage anyone who's dealing with underperformance is to be really open-minded about it. The purpose of this is talking about turning around underperformance. No one wakes up wanting to be an underperformer in an organization. The key is working out what's happened for this person and how we can turn it round, because it's much less painful for everybody if we can get someone to perform, to be engaged, to deliver of their best. And certainly that's the best for everybody, because you don't want to have to recruit them, and you don't want to. What we're talking about here is before HR process. So this is, you may well talk to HR, and I appreciate lots of you are HR. You may well engage with your HR BPs to kind of say, I've got a bit of an issue here, but this is not managing someone out of an organization. This is being open-minded about what might be causing the problem and aiming to turn it round. So some people call it development plans, performance improvement plans. It might just be a documented word with that person that's going to just set them back on the right track. Let them know that you've drawn a line in the sand, and you're going to, you've noticed the performance isn't as it is, and you're going to support them in turning it round. So that's what we're talking about here. So we don't know what that particular level cause of underperformance is. So lots of you said people's productivity had dropped off. So this person, Karen, she was delivering everything. She was her outputs were off the scale for a good period of time, but actually you've noticed that her outputs have dropped off. Let's think about what that cause could be. There could be any number of those. In fact, that's before I move on to the causes and what we do. If you've got someone who isn't productive or has dropped in productivity, what are the possible causes that you could think of? Pop them in the chat. What might be causing low productivity? So Jason's saying they could absolutely have something that's going on outside of work, which is either emotional issues or health issues that are affecting their energy or stamina. They're not sleeping or whatever it is, so they're not as productive as ever. They may not be feeling engaged. They may not be motivated to do with the line manager. Overall stresses could be work or life, home life, financial stress, health, wanting to be elsewhere. Anything like that could affect productivity. So a lot of these we're saying are no longer interested or engaged here. So those could be issues. Can you see anything? Oh, absence, Pedro said absence of clarity. They may think they may be doing a job that's actually subtly changed, but they haven't realized it. They may still think that what they're doing is actually great, and maybe it was great 2 years ago, but expectations have moved on and they haven't quite moved on with it. Maybe there's been a shift in technology or something like that, which that would speed up how they work, and everybody else is working more effectively or faster using that new technology, but they haven't wanted to go down that route. So there's also lots and lots of those. And actually, if I'm doing training on this, we get people to come up with different kinds of underperformance and think which of these causes they could be. And without fail, people will find that the cause will fit into one of these boxes, but very often the cause could be any one of these or 2 or 3 of them. So we always want to be open-minded what the cause is, because there could be very legitimate reasons. We shouldn't be going in assuming this person's lazy in terms of that, but actually they might, as Pedro is saying, they may not know how to use something. There may be a sort of a physical cause or something that you can fix. If that is the case, once we've diagnosed it, or the line manager has diagnosed what the issue is, and that's having a conversation that I'll come back to, the line in the sand conversation, then it's relatively easy to think of how we can turn that underperformance round. So if they haven't got clarity of what's expected, then that suggests that they don't have clear goals, objectives, or milestones, or those that they have not been kept up to date. They may not be smart, so they might not be specific enough. There's too much room for interpretation. Maybe they don't have a clear job description or responsibilities, changing priorities we've talked about, going back to the line manager. Maybe the line manager hasn't given them any feedback. So when they were super productive, maybe the line manager just took it for granted. They're like, oh, I'm not sure whether I need to do this. I think I'll do this. The manager hasn't said, oh, you were, I don't know, delivering outputs at whatever rate, and now you're delivering them at a different rate. Very often it's because there are not structured performance management activities, or conversational communication going on between the line manager and the individual, means that people go slightly off track. So very, very often, lack of clarity, which is still, I think, one of the most common causes of underperformance, it could be turned around by the line manager, or even better than that, it could be prevented if the line manager is carrying out good performance management activities, business as usual, setting objectives, agreeing milestones, doing one-to-ones, providing feedback and recognition, and realigning, refocusing performance as you go through. So all too often managers and managers don't always have the skill or awareness of this. So poor management training is quite often to blame. Now, it's interesting we're talking about managing underperformance here. For me, if I'm working with people, I would always recommend that we should be doing training to all of our managers on what is good clarity, how to set good quality objectives, how to provide good quality feedback and make that a habit, and embedding those kind of behaviors come even earlier than this, because they are the preventers of these things happening. So lack of clarity, that's how you can address that. Individual attitude or skill, maybe it is down to the person that they're choosing not to perform. And I say lots of those are external issues affecting work life. Yeah, I think possibly people have adjusted their work-life balance post-COVID. So maybe that does feel, people feel that's the new work contract. It can be that the job's evolved, or maybe they were recruited into a job that doesn't really fit them. It doesn't mean they're not good. But these things here, where we think it's down to the individual, it's kind of saying that they are willfully choosing not to perform. I think that's really quite unusual, really quite unusual. Like I say, I always say that people don't wake up wanting to be an underperformer. So, but quite often line managers, if they come to you in HR and say, oh, this person, they just don't want to perform, so the challenge, I'd say, given this audience here, is that more often than not, the cause is going to be about clarity, or a chunk of it will be about lack of clarity. And more frequently than is the case, and I must admit I am being subjective here through experience, but more frequently than it is the case, the line manager will assume that it's an attitude issue, but the attitude issue could well stem from the relationship with the line manager. So again, line managers training, developing our line managers is so crucial for this. If you want to create a culture of high performance, supportive performance, avoiding underperformance issues, and avoiding underperformance is not the same as ignoring underperformance. So preventing underperformance is not the same as ignoring it. If we want to have a preventative culture, then managers will be talking to people all the time about what it looks like. Skill, maybe they haven't had the training. This you'd think would be relatively easy to pick up and relatively easy to solve, assuming that once they get the training, they can then perform. In a post-pandemic world, or even during a pandemic, I think it is possible a bit more of this slowed people down, because people were not necessarily sitting next to each other for training. There were people being onboarded remotely. It wasn't quite so easy to get that immediate human feedback. Some of the quality of the skills training done remotely might not have been the same as the experience people would have had in-house with other people. So there could be a little bit more where people haven't picked the skills up as quickly as we might like. And then finally, surrounding environment. We're not allowed now for people to have kids working at home with them. That should not be the case, but there still are distractions that can affect things. Have people got suitable working environments, outside stressors, which many of you have talked about there? Or occasionally there might be a perception that others are working in a certain way. I see that a little bit with cultures. You can have cultures to do with how people use your internal social media, whether it's Slack or Skype or Teams, that some people will leave their out of office on indefinitely and not respond within a certain period of time. So again, culturally, if you've got that going on in your team or your organization, I'd really encourage you to agree ground rules for what what is expected in terms of how we perform in this sort of environment, because then you can again nip things in the bud. You can't really tell someone not to do something if everyone else is doing it, so you have to get people together and agree what's the right way of working, almost like a management charter or a comms charter. So in summary, if you get these causes, we need to provide people with clarity of expectation, structure and feedback if the cause is clarity. If it's individual attitude or will, we need to understand the underlying issue and provide clarity, motivation or support. If it's skill or knowledge, training, coaching. And bear in mind that just training course on its own won't do it. So coaching is more long-term in terms of solving things. And surrounding environment, make sure that the individual understands what the expectation is for them personally, or any cultural issues are addressed. The key message that you want to make sure goes through to your line managers is that the best thing for everybody is for people to face up to performance challenges, not let them just go on and on and on and on. So this term is, the best thing you can do is grasp the nettle. Now I have it on good authority that if you grasp a nettle leaf between your thumb and forefinger, it won't sting you. But if you brush against it, then it absolutely will. And that's the whole thing, is for me, be really brave. When I run the training with managers and I say, how would you feel in 6 months' time if you realized that your manager thought you were an underperformer and didn't say anything to you? And most people would be absolutely gutted. Now, because they'd be disappointed, they'd feel unsupported. And that's the same for people that report into, that's the same for most people. So the thing with that is, are your line managers courageous? Are they picking up when people are not performing, and just giving constructive feedback as to what is expected? So bringing people back on track. Think about it like navigating. If you're sailing a boat across the ocean, make sure that you've got a compass and you're just basically, you've gone slightly off track, you readjust performance. What you don't want is people go way off track. It takes you so much longer to come back online. So managers need to be more on it in a constructive way, supporting people to perform, not brushing things under the carpet, or the line managers themselves not being so exhausted that they haven't got time to talk to their people about what they're doing. So we need to encourage that culture of grasping the nettle and having those conversations, preventing things, nipping things in the bud. And if it turns around that they need to have what I would describe as a line in the sand conversation, where the performance has continued to don't go downhill, or you've supported people and they're still not quite getting there, what's very important is that your line managers know how to have a line in the sand conversation. And a line in the sand conversation, I won't go through this in detail because this is more sort of one-to-one training for people needing it. They need to be able to be very clear on what the behavior or lack of performance is. The individual needs to hear that message. Often explaining what the impact is of somebody not doing something in a certain way, then that helps people buy into doing something differently. Now, a word of warning, if we were talking to someone and someone going back to that list of what you guys talked about in terms of productivity, issues at home, health, family, money, quite emotional things. If you as a line manager start to talk to someone and you find out there's something really quite big going on, then that's not really a line in the sand conversation. That's a, how can I support you to perform conversation, with the caveat that once the stressor has gone away, or once you've supported them, or once you give people time to get things back on track. If it then really doesn't get back on track, you don't just leave it forever, right? You can't just have people who are endemic non-performers. But if you're finding out for the first time that someone's got a health issue, then you need to have a bit of empathy and support. But let's say that that's not the case. The person's simply taken their foot off the pedal. Then we need to understand what the cause is. Are they lacking in clarity? Agree how you're going to turn things round with them. So agree your future expectations. So this is a minimum level of performance that's acceptable. Let's just be really clear about that. Agree what support they need in order to achieve that. And it should always be about helping people to perform. Effectively, you're refocusing them. But what's very, very important about this refocusing conversation is that it's captured, it's documented somewhere, because you don't want to have to do it time and time and time again. And again, many of you are HR, many of you will have had people coming to you saying, oh, this person's a non-performer, I want to take them through the disciplinary process. And you'll say, do they know that they're a non-performer? And they'll go, well, they should do. Have you got any evidence or documentation of that? Almost certainly not. Right. So you need your line managers to just be regularly talking to people what's expected. And if they get to the point where it's a line in the sand conversation, be very clear about that and just say, I'm just going to capture this, and let's just be really clear. Let's put these improvements in place. But if this happens again, it may be a more formal conversation. And again, it's using it appropriately. I'm giving a very high level view on something that we'd spend a few hours training people on. But this is the sort of thing that you want your line managers to be really clear about, to be able to deliver appropriately. Okay, so final slide. How to turn around a culture. If you're feeling it's more of a cultural issue, what you want to do is try and make sure that your organization has got a culture of output driven priorities and goals. So it's not about everybody being dragged back to the office. And I've got to say, it makes me sad when I see the big companies saying that everyone's got to come in, because I think they'll lose people. But yeah, by all means, you want to create times for people to have energized with humans, for sure. But it is really, if they don't clearly know what's expected of them, just because you're in an office is not going to make you suddenly be more productive. It's just going to make you more noisy and more present, more visible. It's not going to make you more productive. You need to know what productivity looks like, and it needs to be outputs. Encouraging managers to learn how to make feedback business as usual. So catch people doing things right, correct people if they're not doing things right. If possible, create things like productivity metrics and systems to track. So some jobs, it's quite hard to track where you are. So can you benchmark? If you're someone working in a customer services environment, some of those are KPI driven. So can you identify benchmarks or baselines, but then encourage the person to say, okay, so what part of your job could you improve? How could we make you more productive? Or how could you be more productive? So involve them in it, but use metrics and measures, benchmark where people are, and work with them to set a sort of a growth or improvement target that they're interested in. So getting people to think about how can they be more productive, as opposed to just rocking up and going through the same old motions on an ongoing basis. In terms of behaviors and role expectations, make sure those are clear as well. It's one thing having objectives, but do you have you might have a set of values, or you might have a set of behavioral standards, but it's so much easier with any of these things. And if you're a small, fast growing business, these sort of things you can start to document, work in small teams, say what is the etiquette around here, document it, catch it, because then if it's documented, it's much easier to be clear with people and to have a gentle conversation if they are going against that. So I've talked about productivity, I've talked about empowering the individual, and absolutely make sure recognitions, feedback and recognition, they're similar, but go out of your way to recognize those who are performing above and beyond. It's so energizing for people to see that they're being recognized for doing a great job, but also that others are as well. That motivates others to be productive and deliver those outputs. So it works both ways. Okay, I feel like there's quite a lot of content there, so I've paused even though I'm speaking at high speed, and my apologies if you're listening in a foreign language, as I noticed on a chat recently. If anyone's got any questions or comments, Mike, going you slightly disagree with output-driven priorities and goals. The mechanism by which they are achieved is also very important. I would agree with that. I suppose what I'm saying outputs is just so people are clear on what the deliverable is. What I don't like is seeing goals which are continue to or assist, or where they're just a process and it's not really clear what that individual is going to do. But I mean, if you're talking about the behaviors that people use when delivering a goal, I would agree also. But you're saying the mechanism, that's also maybe about following processes potentially. Feel free to explain further. All I'm saying is I don't like seeing goals which are just the how to do something. You want to know when you've achieved it. It's not really, it's got to be something that is a target, that you would definitely know that it's been achieved as much as possible. Any other comments? Feel free, anyone who has any other comments. We will, yes, well, that's it, Lucy, you do. And everyone knows what the SMART acronym stands for, but actually it's incredibly hard to write a SMART objective. It's really, really much harder than people realize, for exactly the points that we're going above. But the whole conversation is what you want. And maybe that's the whole thing, is you need to get those managers to be able to agree goals, not just set them, because the most important thing is that the person whose goal it is clearly understands it in the same way as the manager does, if we're going to assess performance against it. There's also something for me about motivating people, finding out, tapping into people's passions, exciting people, because it's discretionary effort. That's what engagement is in productivity, and finding ways for people to recharge. It's a real grey area. I mean, objectives is part of it, but also understanding people as a person and truly maybe flexibility is important to somebody so that they want to deliver their most as well. So it's working out what works for them. I like that. I imagine your name is not Heyo, but Heyo, that's a great idea. You ask employees to write the goal first and then review your manager. So then that's going to be refined with people, isn't it? I'm sure we're in agreement, Mike. You've been on enough of these webinars. I respect your view. It's probably quite hard for me to understand, and maybe the context that you're talking about there. So you want people to get home, but they need to get home in a safe way every day in that context. Where do you work? What organisation is it you're working for? Intrigued. Okay, so I'm going to stop recording here, and as I said, my colleagues will send out the recordings to people, any links, anything you do want. We will share to you, just a few things to share with you.